Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast, episode 12. I'm here again with Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Not bad. I just got back from the mall where I went to a meetup group of free thinkers. So, had kind of a fun discussion. I got to make the ending of slavery was about one economic model beating another arguments. And and that was I think it was actually very well received. And I'm always surprised at how well the talking points that I can get from someone like alternative hypothesis really do play on liberal atheistic moderns. Now these were a bunch of like boomer age men who that's typically I've noticed the predominant demographic at these sorts of meetups, but it was a fun time. Anyway, I remember we talked about last week maybe talking a bit more about nationalism and the nation state. So I mentioned before, and I think this is a good resource. I'm actually kind of slowly going back and forth through different parts of this, the medieval origins of the modern state. But this isn't so much about the nation state, although the concepts are fairly related. So there's a number of dimensions to the issue. One of the main like theoretical questions to ask is what comes first, the nation or the state? Because there are several nation states where it seems like the state structure created the national identity or had a large hand in shaping the national identity. And then others, like, say Germany in the 1890s, where the nation definitely existed, people recognized it, and that nation formed the state after the fact. So, what's your take, just to get started, on a definition for the nation state? How is it different from the nation? How is it different from the state? You're muted. All right, we're waiting. So, if we can't figure this out soon, we might have to.
Yeah, that was
All right.
that was a fact that I don't have a mouse right now, so everything is by the tab. The German state and the German nation, when people think of like the 1870 founding, um, it was really predicated on existing commercial structures, economic unions, and of course the Holy Roman Empire. So German statehood had existed for a very long time. And, we can get into the nature of the Holy Roman Empire and the ways in which it would differ from a modern nation state. But, there's a historical context to all of this. So there is a feedback loop between people who think of themselves maybe as the anti-patriotic nationalists or the anti-statist nationalists, the people who feel that there is a state, they live within a state, and that state is antithetical to the national interest, to the interests of the people who live within that state. And then, on the other hand, you have people who are anti-nationalist statists, people who believe that nationalism is a threat to the state. And these can exist in both in one person at the same time because of identity politics. So you could have a state in which, on the one hand, you have someone who wants, like for instance, German nationalism to be more prominent in state ideology, but on the other hand, wants to decrease the power of Polish nationalism within the German state, or something like that. So, like when we look at the history of the nation and the state and the back and forth between them, I have to go to just the first principles of, well, what is a nation? A nation is an in group, it's an identity. And so you look at the origins of the ability for people to conceive of themselves as a collective, to conceive of themselves as being part of an in group. It starts with the individual as a cohesive person. It moves up toward, your family, your tribe, and so on. And so the nation is an extension of that basic psychological structure, just extended outward and outward. The state is a different thing. Libertarians can conceive of a state in which there would be no collectivism, there would be no identity politics, there would be nothing larger than the individual and maybe his immediate family or something like that. So the nation state is particular, in my mind, is particular and specific to, mostly 19th and 20th centuries. And it came to predominance because it was thought of as a good countermeasure to the old aristocracy in a lot of ways. That the aristocracy saw itself very, in many cases, as transnational. Now we can come up with counterexamples, but there was, Ukrainians, who were marrying with Germans and Romanians. And when you look at actually a lot of the princes and the kings in places like Bulgaria or Yugoslavia, Romania, if it's of some German line, a lot of it goes back to the Franks. It goes back to Charlemagne. And so these people, their ethnic lineage, the way that they conceived themselves, was as being a stem or a branch of the tree of Charlemagne. They thought of themselves oftentimes, to get esoteric about it, as being descendants of some secret sons or daughters of Jesus, or some other like ancient Hebrews or something like that, so that they would be like the kings of the Bible. They would then be descendants of those kings. But they didn't think of themselves in this national sense. They didn't have this idea that we are part of this in group known as the Romanians or the Bulgarians. So it was a very different conception from nationalism. It was the idea that, you are part of this class of people, almost a race of people who rule over Europe, and you all have your own territories, you have your own private property, and you administrate it in a way that you feel is just and that benefits you and your descendants and honors your ancestors. And this was then extended to little fiefdoms and little plots of land that were owned by minor aristocracy. And that was sort of how the chain worked. And the vast majority of the population, sometimes 90%, would own no land at all and would just be working the land and were not conceived of as having really legitimate interests beyond, it might be the way that we look at animal rights today, that animals, they have the right not to be abused, not to be inflicted with cruelties, but that they don't have any, they don't have any personhood really. And that is how the aristocracy thought of the peasantry, is that they weren't really people in the fullest sense. They were something like animals. Maybe you shouldn't treat them cruelly, but they're more of a resource that you use. And the idea of nationalism is that now all of the people are part of one unit. It's not a farmer with his livestock, is the way the aristocracy thought it. Now the idea was we are all people, we all have personhood. And so nationalism was very much connected with humanism and liberalism and the Enlightenment. And all of that, I look at it as a cynical thing. I look at it as the people who invented those ideologies were doing so cynically because they saw that ideology as a great way to destroy the aristocracy. They saw populism, that mass broad appeal, as a wedge or a lever to knock the aristocracy off their position of power and then to come into power themselves using this deception and this lie of egalitarianism. Now, there were a lot of true believers, and a lot of intelligent people might have been true believers, but I think that there is an element of cynicism. And I think, a Marxist analysis where you look at the class interests, you look at the material interests, you can see why people who were not the aristocracy, but had a lot of elitism within themselves, egotism, as well as mercantile power in society, you could see why those people would be materially interested in inventing an ideology of liberalism, populism, humanism, nationalism that would unseat the ruling aristocracy so that then they could come in and seize power from the resulting power vacuum. So that's kind of my explanation of how nationalism as we know it arose. But it does have, deeper roots in just human psychology.
Yeah, that's a very good framing for it. Um, but before the Romantic philosophers kind of justified the national identity, there are examples of states that had a definitive ethnic character. I don't know, maybe the Netherlands in its mercantile period, there was certainly some sort of organic cultural base that was ubiquitous. Although then again, the Netherlands had a large immigration of Jews, so I'm not sure. But I mean, that's a good question. How many states prior to this like articulation of the nationalist conception? How many states de facto were nation states? But first, I kind of want to look again at what the nation is. You said an extension of in group, which that's maybe a very psychological reading. I think the classical definition would be shared kin, shared language, and shared culture. So, and we can definitely project our conception of in group onto people who are not members of that. So it seems like, and then when you go on to the fascist conception of the nation as this kind of organic structure, there's, I don't know if there's a good reason to conflate in group or yeah, that in group notion with nationalism. So I might differ with you there on how you define the nation. Do you want to re-examine that in light of this shared language, shared culture, shared ancestry?
Well, I don't know. So starting with like the family, I mean, I suppose you could have twins separated at birth who would be kin, but didn't share the same language, didn't share the same culture, country of origin, or that all that. But for the most part, your family, you share all of those things. You share those, and I see them as means of communication. So if someone speaks a different language, I can use a translator. We come from different cultures. We can kind of try to work past those differences or something like that. But it's basically a means of communication. So the more of these things, the laundry list of things you listed there is they are commonalities that help you get past kind of basic human instincts, I would say, of is this a friend, is this a foe, idiomatic ways of speaking, communicating things via body language and whatnot. You're trying to dissolve all of those, aforementioned traits so that you can get to the essence of what you're really trying to communicate. And so then you can easily connect and view each other as real human beings, taking into account, of course, the concept of Dunbar's number. I think that we can expand that concept and say, well, it's not just a hard and fast 200 people or something, but it's also your ability to conceive of another person as a person is, do they look like you, do they sound like you, do they act like you, and all of these things. So when I say extension of in group, I'm saying that the first identity is the self identity. That is, I am me, I speak this language, I have this culture, and you look in the mirror and you identify yourself. Then from there out, you have your family. And of course, interracial families complicate this, but oftentimes you look like the fellow members of your family, you sound like and talk like them. And so out from there comes nationalism. And I can't conceive of really the idea of a nation. Like, to me, these are roughly synonymous characteristics. The idea that you would have like similar language, for instance, is a good one, because when you look at the pan-Germanic movement, they viewed, for instance, Dutch people and German people as belonging to a wider race of Germanic people. And they did this because Dutch and German are actually very similar languages. It's easy for one person to learn the other, and you can read a lot of the other. So that is, from my perspective, an extension of what I'm saying here, where a German person can look at the Dutch language and say, hey, this is not very foreign to me. Therefore, this is part of a wider shell than the nation. It's not part of my nation because it's not totally mutually intelligible, but it's part of a wider shell. Then you can go within that and you can say Bavarians speak different from people from Berlin. And so sometimes there's miscommunications there. Are they part of the same nation? Well, we say that because there's some threshold of mutual intelligibility that is reached, and that's a subjective consensus. Let's say it's 99% or even higher than that. But still, you have those subcultures, and at different times, there have been Bavarian independence movements. And they haven't succeeded recently, but there used to be a kingdom of Bavaria, which was in some ways nominally independent, although of course always economically tied to its German neighbors. So like these things are not hard and fast, and I see a very much a continuum running from the individual, the family, your local region, your local subculture, and now of course with the internet, we've removed a lot of geography's influence in the formation of in-groups. Historically, you look at maps, and if you want to look at an in-group, it very neatly can be geographically mapped. You can say that, okay, well, this culture, the corded ware culture, started in this general area and it expanded outward in a kind of a neat progression, spherically sort of blobbing outward. Now today, cultures are jumping around the world. So people who are liking the same video games, investing their entire life in some video game subculture, you might get two people who are good friends. One's in Japan, one's in America, or something like that. So that's complicated how we conceive of in groups. It's certainly complicated how we view nationalism. And you can see this online where you have different people who, the people who call themselves white nationalists, for instance, they'll be in America and then they'll be in Serbia and they'll say, my friends and family don't get me. I'm alienated from society. But when I'm on this white nationalist forum, I feel like I have more in common with this Serbian person, even though I'm from America. And so that is a kind of in group. Now, is that a nation? Well, no. Geographically, we've conceived as nations as having a very specific, geographical location on the map where you can point to this is where Germany is, and that wasn't always the case with a more city-state based model, and I don't think that will be the case as the internet and virtual culture breaks down a lot of these geographical elements.
Yeah. So, like the Phoenicians were a nation, the diaspora Jews were a nation without codified geographic borders. But going back to the cultural issue, I think you're exactly right in pointing out that cultural movement now is so fluid that it's eroding the notion of the nation. And I think it's kind of destined to erode the notion of the state too. Multinational corporations disseminating culture, so an economic framework and the culture, are leading to a global state model and kind of an elimination of the nation concept. So what's kind of emerging in this narrative is the notion of the nation state as a phase in the evolution of human organization. And briefly, I'm going to have to plug in my Ethernet again. This is frustrating because it worked every other time for like the past several weeks.
Are we still streaming right now?
Yeah, we are. It was just a low.
Okay.
There's a lot of latency. Maybe it's because of the time.
Okay.
Like yesterday when I streamed with Blithering Genius, it was like 5 o'clock. I don't usually stream then, and then now it's the middle of the afternoon. Anyway, so
Yeah.
the nation state, if that's a period in the evolution of human organization, what is it? Because it seems to me that there is a clear link between the state and the nation. In order to develop a nation, you need actual institutions that set up culture and language. Like there's some sort of power structure, a trellis on which then all of the filling in of cultural matter and the language is allowed to evolve out of. So power structures build nations, and reproduction, in its most essential sense, is an act of power. It's an assertion of power, and cliques form and monopolize this ability. But what are the, like, if you're going to trace to the rudiments of when do nations begin to emerge, we have tribal life, and tribes are disseminated. They have tribal gatherings. In Germany, we have conferences to deal with threats from people who are seen as foreign in many cases, but that's still a tribal structure. And I think the jump to a national identity is in some sense coincident with the development of a state, which, like, this book talks about the development of the state as essentially being characterized by permanence and by a recognition on the part of the population that there is some ultimate authority. So the notion of the state is tied to the notion of sovereignty, and sovereignty basically means that all of these people recognize one supreme authority in the state, and that helps to build a nation. So, nations form, once you have a nation, though, then you're able to form larger scale state structures. But I can't think of any multinational state that was not, in fact, formed by a preceding nation state, like the British Empire, the English, and even the history of England itself. You had the Anglo-Saxon ruling class come in. They had a defined national identity, although there were three different Angles, Utes, and Saxons. So maybe this doesn't fit perfectly, but they were part of a broader Northwest German culture that had similar language, that had similar customs, similar mythology, and there was that persistence, and they had a similar mythology. Like the Anglo-Saxon invasion brings the Beowulf saga. They had this, for all intents and purposes, there did seem to be the national ideal already. Whether you could call it a state, I don't know. But by the time they moved to England, they assume state structures because now you have persistent power relations, a persistent threat, um, which really they're the persistent threat. But they have this conflict with the native Celts, and that solidifies these power dynamics. And then later on, you have the Normans come in, and then likewise, the Normans already have this kind of identity, and then they become the ruling elite. The nation disseminates gradually until eventually now you have this concept of England as the ruling class over a global empire. And maybe like globalism could be seen in a sense as like the filtering down of the English identity, the English nation, into all of its subject populations. That's one narrative. But what's your take on the codependence of the nation and the state? Can you think of a multi-ethnic state or empire that wasn't really founded by a single nation?
Well, I mean, guess when you ask that question, the deeper question to me is like, can you have a state where all of the identity populations are equal? And that's probably not the case, because if you can distinguish two different identities, then that means there are distinguishing characteristics. And really, anytime you have an island model, if you take two populations, you put them on two different islands, and you just change some small circumstances, you can get wildly divergent behaviors. And so, if you have two identity groups within a space, say, you have a village and two villages next to each other. One is a Jewish shtetl, which is an insular Orthodox Jewish community, and then just down the road you have some Germans or Poles or Ukrainians, and you change the conditions. It's the same environment, same climate, and everything, but you can get wildly divergent peoples, and those peoples aren't going to end up performing equally when given certain prescribed tasks. So when we talk about the organization of a state, and we find that in every case, all state formation has a predominant ethnic group leading the organization of that state. I mean, that's just kind of a consequence of the inequality of, identity. That if you can distinguish two identities, they are by nature unequal. And we could talk about the Romans, that this Latin people later, they were given this mythic identity of being a Trojan, actually a Trojan descended people. But they're these Latin people. They kind of learn from the Etruscans, and then they gradually take over Italy. Then they gradually take over the Mediterranean. And you said it very well with let's say you have like an Anglo-Norman ruling elite, which then tells its population, "Hey, you're part of us now. We're all one big happy family." And then that country then tells all of its subject countries, "Hey, we're all big one happy global citizen, United Nations thing now. We're all humanists," or something like that. So yeah, that is something that has happened, that you have. I think it's purposeful, and it's from the top down, that you have people saying, wouldn't it be easier to transport goods, to sell goods, to do business, if we could eliminate all of the distinguishing factors between people? If you have a unitary consumer, and all consumers basically want the same thing, you can mold people into consuming machines, then you can control them very easily, because you know exactly what makes them tick. You breed everyone to speak English, you breed them all to enjoy a certain kind of media, and then you can deliver that product and satisfy them and therefore control them. Whereas if you have a bunch of vastly disparate peoples who view themselves as having distinct, important identities, then it's much harder to, control them as easily. They might be in conflict with one another, and for instance, if you said tomorrow, if you explicitly said that the state of China and the state of America are now one unitary state, and we're going to compromise the government of China with the government of America. We're going to form like a single constitution. It's going to be like a twin system where there's going to be like some dual Chinese American. Like Congress would be like half Chinese and half American or something like that. You can see how people would be upset, right? Because there's a Chinese identity and American identity. But if you could, teach everyone in China English, and you could Americanize all the Chinese people, then they wouldn't be offended by that, right? So it's breaking down identities and making identity inoffensive to a global capitalist system, where you can have your own identity, but your identity has to be like, okay, do you like Rick and Morty, or do you like, I don't know, horror films or something like that? Like your identity has to be something inoffensive, something politically correct, something um, which you can just kind of play pretend. It's like the way that children will play family, or they'll play with dolls, they'll pretend, but it doesn't actually have any real substance behind it. People are playing pretend with their identities. And so, on some psychological level, they're fulfilling a basic need, but they're doing so in a way that doesn't causes the least possible problems for a media producing class.
Hmm. Right. Which the nation in that context seems just not to factor in. Um, Before I move on to the next point I want to make, I just want to say, like, I don't know why people use the term ethno-state when there is the term nation state that should mean the same kind of thing. Um, just, that's interesting to me. But I think that, the fascist conception of the nation, it is an actual organic structure, it's a living being, like, that's not the same as this, like, accretion of cultural, linguistic elements that are kind of loosely affiliated with a particular line of descent. Like that's really, materialistic. Whereas the organic conception, yeah, it's still materialistic, but it's the idea that there's some communication that is integrating the members of this nation in a way that's not just dependent on their actual material interactions, that there's some kind of higher racial consciousness, ethnic consciousness, and that spirit of the race just flows through the individual. And when you think of like romanticism in the 1800s and nationalism, that's what you think of. You think of the person being like caught up by the swell of this psychic force, and that psychic force is where the nation is, which maybe that can be destroyed, but I think it is something organic, and I think it's not dependent on a particular set of geographic, cultural, or linguistic ties. It seems to be, maybe you want to reference like morphogenetic fields, some kind of non-local interaction between different conscious agents, something like that. But it comes from the genes, and it more than that, more than just genes, it comes from like fitting into an archetype. Now, the archetype of, say, the white race is not just genetic. I mean, it's genetic, but it also has implications at a higher philosophical level, which we've talked often about, that you have to have aesthetic considerations, ethical considerations, and I think ultimately some kind of metaphysical cardinality. It's an orientation that defines the archetype. And if you have all of that, like what you're selecting for, then the actual nation comes to reflect this. But I don't know. I mean, when I look at people, like individuals, I don't see a solid spectrum of all the different kinds of like Chinese people there could be. I see people fitting into almost preset patterns. Like there's the kind of Chinese person who's like shorter and has a wider head, and the jaw comes out here, and he's kind of childish but also like really smart but non-threatening, and like I've seen him before many times, and when I see that guy I recognize him. And then there's like the tall one with the narrower jaw, and he doesn't look as intelligent, and but they have like this kind of personality about them. Now, at the same in the same vein, I think nations, races, ethnicities have some kind of. I think we're gonna have problems. It looks like have some kind of personality about them that transcends the circumstances that led them to appear in the world. Now, Ken, do you have a green light on, or is this an issue with the camera? Um, okay. Well, that's what it's going to be now, I guess. But this seems like what's the role of the nation in the modern context if the cultural institutions aren't forming that trellis on which the nation kind of grows? Well, if it so happens that there is this deeper spiritual level to it, then it's going to reassert itself, and you might view its reassertion in that fascist conception of the nation through dissident right, deep right kind of movements. So that's what I wanted to say, and it looks like we're still having problems on Ken's side of things. So I'm going to look and see what the chat is saying. And there's some talk about different populations linguistically actually being very similar. And that does happen. But even then, their mode of thought will be quite different. Their culture will be quite different. But like the English and the Irish aren't genetically indistinguishable. They're discrete populations. Um, they cluster differently. Uh, so I'm seeing if there's any other comment I want to address. Daniel Retro says that the English are subhuman. Anglos are reaping their rewards for siding with Jews against their Germanic brethren. The war crimes against Germany will be stacked tenfold on the Britons' heads. That's a little harsh. I mean, I'm like roughly 30% British, so I can't condemn them fully, and I don't think you can blame. I don't like this collective punishment narrative at all. like with the Jews, blaming all the Jews. I don't want to exterminate all the Jews. I don't want all the Jews to suffer. Like, no, there are institutions and groups that are in a concrete sense responsible for things. And I think English society was so stratified, and the Jewish manipulation of the English financial system and markets was so centralized, and it was directed against their own people. That's the thing about the collusion between the monarchies and the Jewish uh, usurers. Like, that was used against their own subject population. So I don't see like that you can blame the English generally for this. I think a lot of English people are very good natured, very intelligent. I wouldn't say they're subhuman. But yeah, they should have like collectively, at least maybe during World War I and World War II, the English people at that point probably should have been more sympathetic to Germany. And that was just pride, I think. It was them seeing that Germany's the only threat. They're the rising industrial power. They've already kind of outstripped us technologically. They're building a big navy too. Like, that was the kind of nationalism that's not spiritual. That really is created and structured by the interests of power, and even the people did see that. So I guess I agree to one in one sense. The English are responsible for not having sympathy with Germany, but in another sense, they're not responsible for collectively colluding with Jews to set up a crooked financial system, because that was the elite. Um, Anglo-Norman aristocrats who did that. So were you hearing all of that, Ken, or were you coming in and out? And what was going on?
I was listening to all that. I was trying to fix my camera angle. Um, but yeah, I think that it's interesting when you look at some of the English aristocracy, because I think it was ultimately down. It's hard because when you look at the exoteric historical record, like I don't remember if it was King George or who exactly the names were, but I remember there's a movie called The King's Speech where they dramatized this, where essentially the king who was supposed to be king ended up marrying this American woman who had already been divorced. So that was a big no-no on two counts. Now, Winston Churchill actually supported that guy for some reason. I think Winston Churchill supported him because he thought that if I can get in with this king, then I can become prime minister, or whatever his goal was. Which is weird because, oh, I think it was King Edward. Edward wanted to just let Germany do what it wanted on the continent. He was interested in just, like the English are not going to gain any more territory in Europe, so let's just, gain territory all around the world. And there that was an attitude that existed among the British. And so the Germans got this really funny picture of what English people were like, or at least the English aristocracy, because Edward visited Germany. And he basically went to Germany and he said, "You guys are great. Like, fascism's cool. I love your uniforms." And he was just very nice to them. And so the Germans, and Hitler especially, thought that, oh, these guys can be reasoned with. They don't want to go to war with us. That's ridiculous. And the problem was the people who hated Germany, the people who wanted a war with Germany, were not going and visiting Hitler and talking to Hitler. And so his perception, the perception of others around him was very skewed. And I just don't think they really understood people like Churchill, or even the historical context of people like Benjamin Disraeli. When you have that long of a history of a very specific kind of power orientation, a very specific view of themselves as, we are the imperial elite, we are, and we don't like the English people. They were not nationalists. They would use nationalism cynically, perhaps, but they certainly saw themselves as being distinct from the, now we say, chav, in Britain, but basically the Anglo-Saxon stock, the people who, or even if it's a deeper Celtic stock, I don't really care what the origins of the people are. But they view themselves as there's basically this huge population of people who were farmers. We forced them into factories, we forced them into tenement houses, we forced them into these terrible conditions, and they're animals, and we can do what we want with them. And so that attitude was antithetical to, something like National Socialism, where the idea was that the economy should be for the benefit of, the individual health of the people, working all the way up to the health of the nation. So there was something very different going on there, and people like Goebbels, and people like Strasser and sort of the left wing of the National Socialists were very anti-England and very pro-Russia, because they looked at things from a strict ideological standpoint. I think Hitler was a little more romantic. I think he was a little more looking at, like, oh, well, we both speak Germanic languages, so this is natural that we should be together. Or he was looking at it from a personal perspective of, like, oh, Houston Stewart Chamberlain is a Germanicist, so the English must be all right. But people like Goebbels would write things before 1924, before the party was kind of unified in a lot of ways. But there was a left wing that was very anti-English, that wanted to support or redirect Russian communism toward a German-friendly position, toward an anti-Semitic position, toward what now we would almost refer to as a Duginist position. I think Duginism takes a lot from the Strasserites and from the national Bolsheviks, as they're called. And Dugin is pictured, there's some pictures of him with those kinds of people in Russia, who wish that the left wing of the National Socialists had won out rather than the right wing. But it looks like people are very specific. There's a Celtic German war going on in the chat, is what I'm picking up here.
Uh-huh. I was looking to see if who is that Western man's assertion was correct, that the English and Irish do cluster together. I'm not saying they're not close. They're obviously close, and that comes from the shared Celtic ancestry. But England, especially southern England, did receive a lot of admixture from northwest Germany, and Normandy at a certain point in time. So, like, I know the English cluster relatively close to, like, the Dutch compared to the Irish. I'm not finding, like, a clear-cut map, though. Anyway, where do you? I know, Ken, you're probably going to come down on the German side, but where do you find yourself in disputes? Like, the Celts were better, the Germans are better.
Yeah, well, I mean, you look at kind of ancient migrations, and the map of Europe at one point looks very Celtic. I mean, there's this big Celtic belt stretching from Britain down to Turkey. And at some point, the Celts lose whatever role they were on. And then, the Mediterraneans, the Latins, basically, the Romans start pushing northwards, and the Germans start pushing southwards from Denmark and Scandinavia. And, the Celts basically have to retreat to the British Isles. And you could say that even continues symmetrically into the Viking invasions. Really, you could say that the Norman invasion is an extension of that. And so, when is that? Like the 11th century? So, we're talking about maybe maybe three, or how many is that? 2,000 years of pretty steady reduction in Celtic linguistic influence, at least. Now, genetic influence is a little bit different. And I think when Carlton Kuhn, for instance, talks about the three types of Europe being the Mediterranean, the Alpine, and the Nordic, um, and then you look at the map and then you look at the history of Europe, it seems like the Alpine type that he describes kind of matches up with what was originally the Celtic homeland, the Celtic area of Europe. So genetically, were the Celts wiped out? I don't think so. I don't think that, the Germans or the Romans went into an area, killed everyone, and just totally started anew. I don't think that's how it happened. But at least from a linguistic standpoint, definitely the Celts have been losing out very consistently for the last 2,000 years, if not 3,000 years. And, and so, yeah, I mean, a lot of people are talking about the old the old Scandinavian thing where you look at it today and you look at Nobel prizes, for instance. Now the Nobel Prize is biased because it's based, I guess, in Sweden or Norway or somewhere. But you look at there's some percentage of like one per 100,000 people, and if you look at the map of Nobel prizes given out to more than one per 100,000 people, it's Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, I think England, and possibly also Israel. Um, so it's like a lot plus Israel. And you kind of have to wonder, why is it that Mussolini remarked, when the Parthenon was being built or the Colosseum was being built, that the Scandinavians really had no, two-story structures. They didn't have any stone structures. They didn't have anything like that. So what was going on here? Why was there such a why is it that in the past Scandinavians lagged so far behind in the historical record, and then today they seem to be so far ahead? And now you could just give like a simple climatological explanation of saying that, well, the South was just better for starting civilization. And so once civilization got started and then it spread northward, then kind of the latent potential of the Scandinavians came out. You could also do a caste based explanation of saying that basically a homogeneous population is not really as amenable to civilization as a heterogeneous population, because um, the the heterogeneous population is going to lend itself to specialization. So you're going to have a group of people who are going to be the slaves, they're going to be the manual laborers, and then you're going to have people who are the decision makers, the rulers. That's going to be very clear cut. Now, in Nordic mythology, there is, and I think we've talked about this before, the Skrulls, the Karls, and the Jarls. It might not be Karls, but I know it's the Jarls and the Skrulls. No, the Thralls, Karls, and the Jarls. Anyway, there's definitely Jarls in there. They had this vision of a three caste system. But at least genetically speaking, historically, culturally, we can look at ancient Scandinavia and say, like, okay, there's a lot more homogeneity than in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, you did get Nubian slaves occasionally. You did get Nordic types, you did get Alpine types. You had all kinds of people living in and around the Mediterranean. So if you believe that a speciated population or a heterogeneous population is going to lend itself more toward specialization and the creation of civilization, where some people are going to be working and then some people are just going to be making art. Why? Because they can, because they just rule everybody else. Whereas in Nordic countries where everyone's pretty much the same, you're dedicating a lot more of your time toward just scraping by and competing within a harsh a meritocracy. In the South, if you're, let's make some kind of Nordicist claim here, that let's say you're in the South, and it doesn't have to be Nordicism, but you're of the Doric tribe, and you just walk into a land where everyone's stupid and lazy and they can't control themselves. You walk in, you are the leader. You don't have to try to be the leader. You just are the leader, and everyone accepts that. this kind of goes to the myth in Russia of the Rus people, the Vikings coming in and being driven out, and then they're begged to come back and lead. Like the common people are begging these Vikings to lead them because they just know they're naturally superior. So, if this is the case, then it would be a lot easier to be a Nordic type living in the Mediterranean where you're just assumed to be a leader, whereas in the North, a lot more of your time is spent competing with other Nordic types within the social hierarchy of that area. So you don't have time to like build the Colosseum or something like that. But I think there's probably not just one explanation for it. They're probably all, mixed together in one way or another.
Right. And I think it's important to note that the Germanics are, in a sense, just Scandinavians. The Germanic tribes migrated down from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, modern day. And the ethnogenesis of the German tribes is in that same region, southern Scandinavia, northern, Denmark, Germany, and the Bronze, yeah, the Nordic Bronze Age. That's where the Germanic languages probably started to spread, and where Germanics today or Germans are basically a mix of like Scandinavians and continental Celts. And the Celts were probably pretty diverse. Like there's the Alpine Celtic, the Hallstatt culture that seems to have started most of the stuff. I mean, but then again, the Germanics and the Celtics have a common ancestry in the Unitized culture. So I mean, they're very related, but at least with all the Germanic people, there's a large degree of Scandinavian admixture. So like there is Scandinavian admixture, not just from the Vikings, but from the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans. Like if you trace it back, the Normans were from what, Sweden, and the Anglo-Saxons. That's you're talking about northwest Germany. That's very close to Denmark, and there's all sorts of genetic overlap. The Scandinavian type is what we look at as the Nordic type. That's why Swedish people look the way they do. Tall, usually fair complexion, light skin and or hair and eyes. And I don't know. They've accomplished a lot. So I want to see if there's any specific claims on this point. But again, going back to nationalism and its relation to the state, like the particular place on the map is not as important as a type that people are living up to. Um, so I don't know. I'm not sure I appreciate the attitudes relating to like English supremacism versus Scandinavian supremacism. Like, yeah, objectively, the English have invented more things that led to a wider transformation of society than anyone else. But again, yeah, the English have Scandinavian ancestry. They also have Celtic ancestry. Now, going back and looking at the Celts versus the Germans when they were still pretty separate, yeah, objectively, the Celts had a higher degree of civilization. And you don't want to just point to climatological factors, but obviously the Germans could not produce as much food in Scandinavia and Germany as the Celts could in France and England. Like France and England are way better agricultural territories. So but that doesn't mean, though, that the people living in Germany weren't actually, per person, a lot more competent. Maybe they had a higher IQ despite not living in a civilized condition. I mean, it's very likely that living in civilized conditions leads to low IQ over time because the selective pressure isn't as strong. You have more of a support structure to hold up degenerates. And the Germans had a very intense selective pressure all the way up until the modern period in Scandinavia, and until they, but and look at the contrast between the effectiveness of Viking warriors versus the effectiveness of Frankish warriors. Um, Obviously, the Scandinavian people at that point had faced harsher selective pressures. They were taller, they were stronger, maybe they were smarter. I mean, it's not unreasonable to assume. Again, that's getting into more like supremacism. Um, yeah, Western man genetic study done in December shows 20% Norwegian admixture in modern Irish population. That's probably because of the Norwegian colonies in the Viking Age in northern Ireland, which was very recent, relatively recent. And I know there's a genetic, there's a haplotype study relating to the like McDonald, McGuinness. I can't remember exactly what they were, but all these last names starting with Mac, most of them have haplotype R1A, as opposed to the majority Irish population is R1B. And they traced it back to like this one guy who was actually descended from some of the Viking invaders, merchants. They actually got along very well, the Irish and the Norwegian, according to this history I listened to about it. But this one guy kind of ended up identifying with the local heritage and kind of claiming Irish ancestry when he was actually Norwegian. And his R1A branch spread all throughout the McDonald's and a couple other related families from the same clan. I thought that was interesting. But I think I've kind of had enough on the national question through this vein. We had some other topics that you might want to hit, right, Ken?
Yes, let's see what those were. I think I wanted, well, I know I had the transparency of the self. I had gracile and robust types, veganism,
I'm kind of interested in gracile and
grounding
robust
genetics.
types because that segues pretty nicely, talking about nations as living up to particular archetypes. So, what do you have there on or gracile and robust?
Yeah, so the gracile type sort of implies that you have access to food because the point of the robust type, for instance, Samoans are an extreme robust type, where they needed to have the robustness because you were traveling across very far distances in boats on islands where you didn't know if the island was going to be suitable for farming or fishing or anything. So you're essentially that body type that makes the calculation of food scarcity, food uncertainty. And so there's this natural robustness that you're storing up food, you're storing up energy. That also relates to fighting and violence. That I saw a funny video the other day where a Samoan kid, this must have been in New Zealand or something, where it was a mixed, like Pacific Islander mixed white population. And there's like one Samoan kid or Fijian or whatever he is, and he's the same age as all the white kids, but he's just massive. I mean, he must weigh twice as much as the other kids. He's probably like 150 pounds or something. And they're playing rugby, and he just knocks right into them. They all just get knocked off their feet. So when you have a robust type like that, it might also not just relate to food scarcity, but it also might relate to how physical violence is organized within that community or society. So if you have a society which is peaceful, a society in which there's a ban on organized violence, or let's say that organized violence is done through much more skilled methods like fencing or dueling or marksmanship or something like that, or like knights dressing up in extremely expensive armor, which would be like the price of a Ferrari today. You're basically putting on your Ferrari and you're riding your Mustang literally into battle. So that kind of stuff, whenever you add on something to physical violence, which makes it more skill based or adds on an element of low time preference or something like that, then you're sort of skewing the population away from a brute force, robust type in which your resources are they're in your body, they're in your physical form rather than outside of your physical form. And oftentimes we'll look at the robust type and say that's the warrior type. We'll look at the gracile type and say that is the That's the like the priest type. And then you can also look at it in a gendered way of, men are expected to be robust, women are expected to be gracile, but then you look within the male female and you say, well, a gracile man is a nice man. We sort of think that the robust man, he might be a jock, he might be a Chad, he might like be a bully. Whereas the gracile man, he might be soft, he might be feminine, he might be kind. The opposite is sort of true with women in certain cases, that a gracile woman, because she has such a high sexual market value, that uh, she's able to be cruel, she's able to be mean, because she's kind of fighting at the top of the social hierarchy. She's kind of bitchy, or she's a mean girl. Whereas a robust female, um, and this is kind of like a dwarvish woman in a way, like shorter, fatter women tend to be nicer. And I think this is something that a lot of people observe without realizing it, is that the kind of like mother figure, or women who are much nicer, oftentimes, now again, it's not universal, but um, this is because they have very low sexual market value. And so the way that they compete socially is very different. They are struggling just to gain acceptance. And so they're trying to be nice. And so sometimes you get a gracile man who has this very nice, inoffensive personality. And then you have a robust woman who is, again, she's just trying to be nice. She's trying to get social approval through kindness. And they pair up. And then on the other hand, you have the robust Chad and the skinny Stacy, or the gracile Stacy, who then pair up in that way. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at that. You can look at it from an ethnic angle. You can look at it from a religious angle. You can look at it like the Indo-European case system. You can look at it through gender and sexuality. But we have touched on it before. We talked about the three, when we talked about the three sort of types, or in Hindu society, which I can't remember the names of, but I'm sure you do.
Yeah, Sattvic, Rajasic, and Tamasic. So the Sattvic would be the slender, the Rajasic would be
Mm-hmm.
more muscular, and then the Tamasic, which is the third category, would be like bigger, more weighty. So Brian Nguyen is kind of challenging your assertion that the more robust females tend to be nicer. All he does is
Mm-hmm.
ask, fatter women are nicer, and that kind of rings some alarm bells in my mind as well, because fat women usually have a lot of anxiety, or not anxiety, but animosity and resentment because of the way
Mm-hmm.
they are and the way that they're treated in virtue of that. But I think you're more talking about someone who's like got wide shoulders, maybe a girl, and maybe wider rather than actually, fatty.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the social context. So you can also think of a woman who is extremely slender, who's almost like, she's wispy. She's like, there's nothing there. She's got no substance to her, like an anorexic type almost. And obviously, then you would say, okay, this probably isn't a mean girl. This is probably someone who is going to be nicer. But um, I think there is a principle where, at least nowadays, because the way our sexual hierarchy has been reorganized, that I think that uh, there's different driving elements, there's different driving factors. Like we can all imagine, and there's a professor, I think at Fresno, who's like this obese woman. She's this overweight woman, and she's very critical. Or you think of the classic, the feminist with like the purple hair and the glasses, or Trigglypuff or something like this. There are women who are obese and they get into this fat acceptance movement thing, and then they become very aggressive. See, what historically, I think what fat women used to do is, I think they used to fit into this kind of motherly archetype, or this kind of uh, uh, this different archetype, and now they're being funneled into taking their anxiety and their neuroticism over their appearance, and instead of inwardly directing that and being self-critical, they are outwardly directing it and being aggressive about it. So it's a different social circumstance. Um, like we can imagine women who would be thinner, who would be nicer, and the circumstances in which that would happen. Um, but there is that like that popular conception of like the Stacy, and then I just have this idea in my mind of like when you think about uh, uh, like a I don't know how to say it, but there's a certain kind of like a cat lady or a single woman or like the kind of woman who adopts a lot of children or who works in social services or at an orphanage. And the contradiction, and I can see I can go back and forth on this, but the contradiction I'm seeing is like sometimes there's like a very pure Nordic type of woman um, who is gracile, but she has this extreme altruism. And so then they're still talking about the Nobel Prizes. She's got this extreme altruism, and so she's working in something like as a therapist or in social services or something like that. But it's a hypothesis, uh, and I think basically people have their own set of circumstances, and then they try to survive within that set of circumstances. And different people use, sometimes it's called coping mechanisms, sometimes it's called survival strategies. But often I think that because generally attractive women have the ability to be more judgmental toward others, they have the ability to exclude others because they are in demand. They can say, hey, I'm going to reject you because there are 10 other people who want to be my friend or who are interested in me. Whereas when you're physically unattractive, you have to accept anyone who comes along, and that basically entails being a much nicer, welcoming, tolerant sort of a person. So, it doesn't really do the same thing for men, where a man who is fat can often be very antisocial, and a man who's skinny or something isn't necessarily going to be mean. But what I was sort of thinking of was Tolkien's elf dwarf dichotomy, where we look at the dwarves and we instinctively know that they're a warrior people, that they're confrontational, that because of their robustness, they have a certain personality type. They're gruff. Whereas the elves, we can look at their gracile features and we know that they're peaceful. We know that they do their due diligence. They're slow to act. They're methodical, meditative. So we infer these personality types about groups of people by how they look. And so, then the question is, why is this just a purely cultural thing? Is this just a phantasm that we've been brainwashed into believing? Or is there some reality behind this correlation? Is there, and what is the nature of if there's a correlation, is there some kind of causation here? Is it that people who are more conscientious in a way, are they more, does somehow that will then direct them toward expressing a gracile type? Or is it that people who have a more robust type are more like chemically inclined toward violence? Like there are like the amount of fat tissue that you have in your body does influence your hormonal levels, or the amount of testosterone, by contrast, does change your body type, right? So
Yeah.
there's all kind of hormonal interactions. There's a brain body connection here, and we can see that when we look at different types of people, whether they're fantasy creatures or in real life.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, there's also like a short, slender type, the Mediterranean type, who doesn't, it's not elfish. And they are hardworking. They're not like super methodical. They're often like high energy, like the spicy little Mexican, I guess is what I'm thinking of. And I don't know where they fall exactly. But when I had that thought, it kind of reminded me of another point that belongs to the previous section. So I want to mention this just real quick, relating to like Nordic versus Alpine or Celtic versus Germanic advantages. My own conception of like what European ethnicities have been successful has to do with what percentages they have for their admixture between the ancient Neolithic stock, the ancient Indo-European stock, and the ancient like Paleolithic European, Mesolithic European stock. So it seems like Greece at a certain point in time had like this golden ratio of the three types: the Aryan, the old European Neolithic, and the older European Paleolithic. And that over time, as Neanderthal admixture has receded, has gone further north, and now in the contemporary period, 200 years ago, England was doing very well, but now you look and Scandinavian society is actually relatively more advanced, and they score better, if I'm not mistaken, on various tests. So that's one element that should be considered. And one more point, just because I'm seeing what Mr. Coolmug is saying. So he says Alexander Graham Bell, a Scot, invented the telephone. Can the Scandies match that level of innovation? And I think by that same logic, you're going to have to admit that the Phoenicians or the Egyptians were inherently a more innovative people, or that the Greeks were inherently a more innovative people than populations in Europe at the time. And it's like genetics matter, but really the flow of information is critical, and trade routes are critical. And England has had far more access to the rest of the world than Scandinavia over time. Now, maybe the Viking Age is slightly an exception to that because the Vikings did go through, northern, the northern route around the Black Sea to access the Middle East. But even then, they didn't have the route with Latin, and they didn't have priests reaching them and giving them all this information. Like there are huge situational advantages that gave English and eventually Scottish people a head start in developing this stuff. But they're part of that North Sea community. Like prior, at a certain point in time, England shifted towards France in its like axis of culture, but prior to, I guess it was the Norman conquest, it was really more of this like northern, Denmark, uh, what do you call it? Northern France, England, uh, da- you know, I'm not, my mental map is not popping up for me right now. Denmark, the Netherlands, southern Scandinavia, all of these were in constant communication and were part of a single cultural complex. And there was all sorts of admixture that went on there. And then if you combine that with like the North Sea area population replacements under manorialism that led to the rise in IQ in this region, like I just don't see the reason for this kind of regionalism, which is one of the reasons I'm not a nationalist. Despite we were talking earlier about like nationalism, but I don't think that the nation model is actually all that useful. Maybe something broader, maybe something more narrow, depending on the context. But what happens is this sort of like parochialism, English supremacism, and this is where you get a lot of people in the alt-right, and I'm not really associating with that anymore, it seems, but the alt-right, you get all of these people saying like, no, the English are better, no, the whatever are better, and it's like just not appealing, not attractive. Like you don't look good saying this sort of thing, and it's very alienating to people outside of that situation. It's not helpful to as a cohesive. It's like no, this is why I like going back to the more ancient roots and like where we are all some combination of Neolithic, Indo-European, and Paleolithic Europeans. And we can trace the features that are associated with these. Like the palest of all of them were the Neolithics. And the ones with the blue eyes were the Paleolithics. And probably the blonde hair spread mostly through Indo-European genetics. So like there's all this red hair. I probably also Indo-European. But anyway, it's like if you look back to those roots, you can see more of a common heritage. And I don't know. I just don't prefer this kind of nationalism. But yeah, I like the outline of the types of more robust and more slender and the personality associates. I think that's perfectly reasonable. But now, again, now going back to the topic, so Mediterranean, slender, short, and energetic. How do they fit into your model, and how do you make sense of them?
I don't usually think of Mediterraneans as being short and slender. Honestly, if you tell me short and slender, I'm either thinking of a woman or I'm thinking of an elf from The Legend of Zelda or something. Uh, I just don't encounter um, a lot of short, slender people. And if I had to say who is short and slender in the world, I would be going toward like people living in the Amazon rainforest or like people living in Thailand or Southeast Asia or something, because you kind of have, and that was also something I wanted to touch on. Why do we think of Asians as gracile? And if you go to Asia, you will see that the rate of obesity is pretty low. Now it's increasing, but they are a very gracile people. And why is that? Well, going back to the theory I discussed earlier, that basically in Asia, violence was not really organized on an interpersonal level. Violence and famine was a huge cause of death, but that was organized by thinking people. It was organized by generals and shoguns and these kinds of, they might have been fanatics, but basically society was structured so that it wasn't like he who was the best boxer got the girl. It was this enforced monogamy for the population where things were stable. It was almost like a punctuated equilibrium society where things would go on very similar, like conditions would remain the same, very structured, and then all of a sudden there would be a civil war. Millions of people would die, but a lot of the people who would die died indiscriminately. Um, like the majority of the deaths were not selective. It was, someone would come into your farm, burn all your crops, and then move on. It wasn't really anything you did. It was almost random, like a natural disaster in a way. And so, whereas like in a Samoan population, a lot of these populations where um, you had a very chaotic daily life, and violence could happen at any moment, and it was very interpersonal. Then, for instance, like your boxing ability would be a lot more important. So like the genes that were selected for tended to select for people who were really good at sporadic interpersonal violence. Whereas in China and Japan, I think one of the reasons why we think of martial arts as originating from China and Japan is because they almost, in their bodies, they have a deficit in their ability to inflict interpersonal violence. They are not the best boxers in the world. And so they actually had to come up mentally, and this was their will that they came up mentally with systems of how do you actually fight other people with your fists. Whereas, like in Africa or Samoa or even Europe, no one was ever like, okay, how do we come up with a systematic way of hitting each other with like our fists and our feet, because that was more intuitive. And I think there was a loss of that intuition in East Asia, where there was much more selection toward mental faculties and ability to adhere to an authoritarian system and things like
Yeah.
that.
Greco-Roman martial arts, though, wrestling and what the Spartans did, were more along those lines. And so I'm going to give my own account for the Mediterranean gracile type. And gracile, not just the skull, but the whole bone structure is more gracile in Mediterraneans. They are shorter on average than Northern Europeans. And I think that's a result of higher degrees of Neolithic admixture. And if you could find a pure Neolithic European from say 5000 BC, they would be short, they would be slender. I don't know if they would look like modern day Mediterraneans. I'm not sure exactly how fair they would be. They would probably be fairer than modern day Mediterraneans because I think like the pale skin of the Neolithic migrants evolved relatively rapidly, having to do with like the change in their diet, eating more grains. But anyway, the reason I think that they are shorter and um, ended up kind of paralleling the Chinese approach to martial arts is that they were, like the Chinese, a domesticated population. The Neolithic cultures were human domesticating cultures, and they bred types into existence. And this doesn't mean that they were able to select for overall competence or overall IQ or overall fitness, but they did select for certain traits regarding sociality and certain physical traits that would make them less threatening. And it's the same thing we did when we domesticated horses. We would take like the most docile male, and give the docile male a bunch of females because that's the way they run their packs. There's like a dominant male and then a bunch of females. And we could control the weakest males and gave them access to the females, and then the whole species became more docile over time. So I think that's basically what's going on. But it didn't result over time in the Mediterranean itself in an increase in docility, probably because of subsequent developments. Like they were domesticated in the Middle East, from 10,000 BC to 6,000 BC. But as these people lived in the Mediterranean region in Europe, they developed their own societies, their own cities, and they lived in cities for thousands of years. Mediterraneans lived in cities for thousands of years before Northern Europeans, and it's no wonder then that like you go to Norway and sit on a bus and there's not a lot of chatter and people are kind of keeping to themselves and being not as sociable and not as adapted to a city environment as if you go to like Italy. Go to Italy and sit on a bus and listen to what's going on there. Italians are loud. Spanish people are loud. They talk a lot. They evolved in that circumstance to an extent. So, do you want to do one more of your topics and then call it a day?
All right. One last comment on that would be, I don't know how you Africans on a bus. Does that mean Africans are the most civilized people because they talk in movie theaters a lot and on buses and they're
No,
very extroverted?
it's because their social groups were larger. Like Homo sapiens social groups are much larger than Neanderthal social groups. So Africans are just used to having a
Okay.
lot of people around, not as a factor of civilization. Like the Neolithics in Europe, they had large population centers because they had agriculture. Africans had large population groups because it's Africa. It's tropical. There's all sorts of plants and animals to eat. So it's like it's not.
Okay.
It's for different reasons.
I would also say it has to do with social sexual selection, where in the North you can be autistic, but if you're really good at like making a certain kind of tool, then I guess you can find a wife. Whereas in the global South, basically whoever is just super confident and super social, doesn't really matter what your skills are. You can just go around, sleep with whoever. I guess the topic that was related to this was male omnivorism and female veganism, which was basically like, I hear this talking point repeated over and over again of if we would just all convert to veganism, then we could like solve world hunger or something like this. Like, I'm not sure how exactly it's rephrased or repackaged as a talking point, but like, if we would just stop eating meat, then we could use like 100 times less like farm area or something like that. I don't know
It's ten
exactly
times
what the statistics are.
10 times
Yeah,
less
but it's like
theoretically.
there's some kind of benefit, right? Like we could have, instead of 7 billion people on the earth, we could have 70 billion people on the earth if we would just be 70 billion vegans instead of 7 billion meat eaters. and it's like a quality versus quantity thing. Where yes, we could all be vegans, but you look at what you look at what's happened to testosterone levels, and I don't think it's because of people mass converting to veganism, but I think it's because corporations, through collusion with the government, have decided to pacify us. And one of the ways they pacify us is they will put like soy in everything, or they'll put corn in everything, they'll put sugar in everything. They put all this stuff in our food into the meat as well. Like you can't just eat pure meat. You have to have like chicken patties, or you have to have like pizza, or like it has to always be along with something else. It has to be fried. And this makes people fatter, and it lowers testosterone, and it makes people more pacified and easier to control. So that this is the situation that we have, and probably people who have looked into diet already know what I'm saying. But I haven't actually heard it voiced before that perhaps like the vegans are half right and the carnivores are half right, and that for optimal gender relations you should have men who eat a lot of meat, and you should force all women to be vegans. Has this been tried before? Like I know in Hinduism they try to force everyone to be vegans, and then like you have societies in which meat eating is promoted. But is there a religious system in which all women are forced to be vegans and men are forced to eat meat? I've
I
never
I
heard of
really
this
don't think
before.
so. No. I mean, that'd be
All right.
interesting.
Well,
Yeah, why shouldn't I mean, soy, as far as I'm aware, soy is good for women, right? Women should eat a lot of soy.
apparently it increases certain risks of breast cancer,
Hmm.
and there are some negative effects of that. But looking at it purely from the position of, um, you know, a meat-based diet is going to increase your testosterone. A vegan diet is going to pacify you. If you wanted, relations between men and women to return to like a harmonious state rather than a conflict-oriented unstable situation, you would want to encourage men to eat more meat, and you would want to encourage women to be vegans, it would seem. Um, but I've never heard of that being prescribed for people.
Yeah, I mean, I might want to use that. Rattle Grebdron, does perennialism have some view on veganism or vegetarianism? Well, yeah. I mean, generally, perennialist systems like Hinduism or Buddhism hold vegetarianism or veganism up as an ideal. I mean, really, they hold up as an ideal. Stop eating altogether and stop breathing. Like that's the ultimate ideal. Um, but yeah, I don't know. My view is that there's a cast of people who probably should be vegetarians, and they're that slender type and more intellectual, more living in their minds, and they don't need all of the calories. The muscle mass would actually kind of just detract from the blood flow to their brain at a certain level. I mean, the smartest people that I've known have either, it's like one of two ways, been overweight, like big fat people, not to insult Kurt, but like Kurt's a big guy, or they've been very slender with big heads. There's not a lot of really muscular, like that kind of person who ends up being super smart. Although it does happen, and when those people are smart, they're like Julius Caesar kind of smart, ultimate pragmatism. They're not gonna get obsessed with ideas for the sake of ideas, and they're really just gonna get the job done. Like a smart person who's well built is formidable.
Have you heard of Chris Langan?
Yeah,
He's supposed to be the smartest man in the world, and he's well built. I mean, I
I
think he was a
consider him
bouncer.
more the Kurt type. Like, and to my mind,
Okay.
that's like there's a regal type of the like barrel chested, stocky, um, kind of person. Not all of them are super intelligent, but some of them are. Uh, I wouldn't say he's like muscular. I know in the past he did bodybuilding, but when I say muscular, I guess I'm thinking more the Rajasic type, where you're not just like brawn, dwarfish muscle. You're more like the Nordic ideal, and you have
Yeah, like there's a, I guess in terms of the shape, there's like a stick figure who's just very skinny. Then there's the cylinder who's just this solid dwarf. And then there's kind of the triangular, like the, I don't know if it'd be Mr. Olympia, but basically you have these very wide shoulders and then this very thin waist is, I don't know, maybe the
yeah the
superhero
Schwarzenegger
type
type.
or something like that.
But like
Yeah.
Schwarzenegger, high IQ, super genetically fit, um, was governor, was a business guy, was an actor, did all this stuff, very successful, and that's when one of those people comes around, you kind of want to use them, you know. Um, but
Yeah.
also when the Regal type
Uh,
comes around, when the Kurt Doolittle type comes around, they're also useful, and they play different roles. I mean, it kind of really does fit that like ruling caste, Regal, larger, more Kurt type, and then like the equestrian head of the military triangle man type. Um,
that's a good word, the triangle man.
mhm.
I had a few uh, last topics if we wanted to run through about morality and genetics. The idea of like the most genetically fit people by a certain standard being the people most interested in antinatalism. Like, I don't think I've ever encountered more antinatalists than in the Perennial podcast. And I would think that the people who would be interested in the Perennial podcast would be the kind of people I would want more of in the world. And they seem to be more interested in how do we like make less of ourselves. And then the fact that you would have, on the other hand, people who you certainly wouldn't want if they were drug addicted or low IQ or immoral in one way or another, having lots of kids. So, you look at that situation and, from a certain perspective, it's immediately bad. And I think the theory behind, I think it's purposely being directed this way, that this trend is not just an emergent trend, that it's on purpose. And I think the idea behind it is that you hollow out the majority of people, like 99% of people are hollowed out. All of their good characteristics are destroyed and degraded through this dysgenic process. And the only people who retain good traits are the people in the 1%. And then theoretically, once you have artificial intelligence and once democracy becomes outmoded, you just push the self destruct button, which is
Yeah.
whether it's, I mean, you could theorize like, are they going to sterilize people with vaccinations? Are they going to do it through the water supply? But you might not even need that. You could just do it psychologically and tell people you get a voluntary sterilization if you want $500, or you just get it because that's the right moral thing to do, or that's the cool, fashionable thing to do, or whatever. But it is conceivable. It's very easy that it's a model that's very top down though. And if for any reason this top down model failed or crumbled, or there was some disconnect, like we could conceive of a cataclysmic event, like an environmental event that would destroy the ability of these elites to control the population, then you would want an emergent model. You would want the eugenic model, which says that we're going to progressively try to improve everyone at every level of society, rather than viewing it as like this 99% versus 1%. We're going to use the European aristocratic model of basically turning everyone into European aristocrats, which is also, I think, kind of a Scandinavian way of doing things. It's kind of a Northern European way of doing things historically.
Hmm.
So, and people, when I lay out this dichotomy, a lot of the way that people try to put it in is they try to say this is globalism versus nationalism. The globalists, like the Kalergi plan, they're trying to do this 99% versus the 1%, and the nationalists have this eugenic idea. And I think there needs to be better terms, because we've discussed this whole time the way that nationalism in the past was not it was not always as we think of it today, and it will not be that way in the future. And so we have to think about this in a new way. And that's why I try to introduce things like the term minoritarianism, because I think it describes what is going on right now. There is a minoritarian strategy being employed, and that if you wanted to combat it, you would use minoritarian means, and clinging on to the idea of like, I'm from this geographical area, and therefore, like, this is my identity and this is who I am. Well, for a lot of people, you grow up in a town, that town was a homogeneous population, and then by the time like you go to college and come back, it's no longer a homogeneous population. That might sound drastic to some people, but that is actually the reality of what's happening. And
Yeah.
so home, it might not be the geographical location where you were born and raised. It might be actually more just being around people like yourself, no matter where it is in the world. And if people view things like that, I think they're going to be more successful than now. In terms of practical politics, things like, is Trump going to be elected, or are we going to get like the alternative for Deutschland in the European Parliament, stuff like that. We are dealing with anachronistic systems. And so we're obviously going to anachronize our thinking in order to deal with those systems. But in a future orientation, we're going to have to move more toward a diaspora mode of thinking, and a less geographical centered mode of thinking. This is what Judaism did when the temple was destroyed. They changed their religion. They maintained a lot of their traditions. They maintained who they were, in the sense that they evolved who they were. And that kind of an evolution has to take place if you're facing similar challenges to what they were facing. They were facing a Roman Empire that had military supremacy. We're facing an American empire with military supremacy. You don't. The Maccabees were not successful. Ultimately, who were successful were the rabbis and the rabbinical model of Judaism, which was a new model. It was an evolved model, and so there has to be some kind of corollary. You have to move away from nationalism, and I think the term deep right could be a useful term, or minoritarianism, or whatever it is. But you have to get past that. You have to get past holding on to those kinds of things,
Yeah.
because it. Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
So Mr. Coolmug is arguing with you, saying the reality needs to be reversed, those situations need to be changed, and he asks, anachronistic how? Well, we talked about this earlier, saying that the nation state didn't always exist. The nation didn't always exist. It came about because of particular power dynamics in their particular relationship to geography. And as situations develop, it may be that the nation model or the state model aren't actually the most adaptive. So one of the flaws with the model of the nation as central to identity of the group is that the nation is kind of a static entity, right? Whereas it may be possible to think of kind of a process-based group rather than an identity-based group. So shared, and this has to do also with differences in what constitutes a shared religion. So there are orthodox religions where it's we believe these things and it's kind of static, and then there's orthopraxic religions where there is a common methodology. And so we can develop a common methodology of grouping, then that can form the basis of, or a trellis on which a new kind of group structure might emerge. And I don't want to speculate too much of what that would look like exactly, and the nation concept is not altogether useless, but without contiguous geographic territory, without the means of disseminating shared language, culture, customs, and identifying shared kin, it's just the way the world is going, it may be the people who survive, the Europeans that survive as Europeans, may not be nationalists. They may have reformulated their method of grouping together. And the advantage there is that you don't just have to hope that the situation is going to be reversed, because you're not just dealing with natural processes. You're dealing with an enemy that has an agenda, that has billions of dollars, that works to forward that agenda, and it involves your extinction. So are you just going to hope that that goes away? Are you going to hope that they fail? No, you're going to do something active and do something yourself. You can't act at the national level. You can't realistically act. Now, when it comes to voting for a politician or advocating for a politician, say you're talking to other, like you're at a meeting of boomers that you found online, like the meetup that I went to today. If they're talking about the liberal candidate, you criticize the liberal candidate. You reward people for wanting Trump. Like, you foster good feelings on the side of the slight right at the nationalistic level. But the serious activity, like where do you put your actual energies, should be in a direction where you have control. You want to be sovereign, right? So build the structure, build the power structure, build the communications framework, and then everything else will develop on top of it. But it has to be built, and it's developed by someone. So, and I think, yeah, a way of looking at this would be like thinking of forming an extraterritorial state, kind of a state within a state, that when the situation's right, maybe that converges on something like a nation state at a certain point in time. Maybe it does. Maybe it converges on something that looks like an empire. Or maybe it's a new model, like more of a business oriented model. There are all sorts of possibilities there, but that's how it's anachronistic. It was a phase in the development of political organization, but political organization has never been static, right? It evolves. These structures evolve. We evolve. And if you don't evolve, then you'll be passed over. Okay. Now, my inclination is just to read the rest of what's down here, and then and go ahead and end it for today. But if you have something to say while I read a little bit, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, people always say, "Oh, there's not a parallel between whites and Jews." I'm just like, in what way are my parallels false? You had a group of people who were facing an extremely powerful military. They put up military resistance. Um, Effective military resistance for whites ended in 1945. Uh, so, if you are talking about that kind of third generational warfare, you are a Maccabee. Maccabees didn't win. Um, it was the rabbinical model that won out, where you said, we're not going to fight the most powerful military in the world using, those third generational warfare tactics. We're going to use religion. We are going to use mercantilism. We're going to get into business, the economy. We're going to succeed where we can succeed. Where maybe it's going to be on the margins or the fringes, but we're going to find some niche. And for Jews, that was money lending. Now, I don't want to be a money lender. I don't want to become a banker. But I think there are parts of society, there are places where there are demands that are not being fulfilled, and someone can fulfill those demands. Now, some of those demands are surrounding in-group, surrounding identity, surrounding purpose, surrounding discipline, surrounding friendship, not on a superficial level, but on a deep level. Comradeship, or the ability to have people who you have a deep connection with, where you're not just connecting over fads and fashions that are created for you, but you're connecting over something spiritual. So there are demands out there that are not being fulfilled, and you don't need a lot of money or power to fulfill these demands. Individuals can come together to satisfy these demands. And so, there are material demands. There are things like, if you have roommates, then the cost of housing is cheaper than if you live alone. So there are obviously things like that. There are things like homeschooling, where, of course, due to the public schooling system, you don't have freedom of choice in your education. But if the local school system is really bad, which it is in some areas, then at least having supplementary homeschooling, where maybe on a weekend or something, someone in the community is really good at a certain subject, say it's mathematics, then they can teach your kids mathematics and they can give them an education that they're not getting at school. So, people can do all this, and there's overlap between different kinds of demands. I mean, there's a demand for music that you can listen to and not feel self-hating. And so there's like a whole genre of parody song that has come out within the last few years, where musicians will take a song that is popular and they'll twist the lyrics and make it into something funny and laughable. So there are superficial demands, there are deep demands. We have to think about how we can and satisfy those demands, again, with sovereignty and actionable stuff that we can do. We can wish and hope and pray that Donald Trump's going to build a wall so the flooding happens slower. I don't want a quick flooding. I don't want people to grow up in a neighborhood and within 5 years have that neighborhood become alien to them. I think that's negative. I think that is a kind of trauma that I don't want inflicted on people. So I hope Donald Trump succeeds in all that he does. But while we are sitting here hoping and praying and wishing, we can still take actions, take steps within our own personal lives to become better and to help each other out, build each other up. That is a mutually beneficial relationship. And I mean, if you want to get libertarian about it, we are trading our time and energy with one another, and the sum total of our exchange is greater than what we individually started with. So that's what I'm advocating, not like because nationalism to me is it's too abstract to be applicable in your daily life. In your daily life, you can do the stuff that I talked about. How do you do nationalism? Well, anytime someone actually comes up with an answer to it, it sounds more like what I'm advocating rather than, I don't know, like forming the German parliament, the Frankfurter Parliament of 1848 or something. How nation states were actually formed in Europe is not what we need to do right now. We need to do something very different. And I think the people who call themselves nationalists, who are actually succeeding, are really internationalists. I mean, people like the Golden One, for instance, who call themselves, oh, we're the nationalists and we're against the globalists. What do they advocate? They advocate self-improvement. They advocate martial arts. They're advocating getting together and doing ritualized activities, which are competitive, which are gendered in their nature. So, like, okay, how is that intrinsically nationalist? Well, from my perspective, the real paradigm is not nationalism versus internationalism. It's really, I would say, it's eugenics versus dysgenics, or there are many other paradigms you could put it into. But if we move beyond that paradigm, I think we'll see a lot clearer what needs to be done in our personal lives, other than every 4 years going to the ballot box.
Yeah.
Or like making memes every 4 years for whatever candidate comes out. There's a lot more we can do.
You don't want to be dependent on another sovereign entity that isn't even of your nation, right? They don't represent your nation. As an Englishman, it's not even supposed to be a nation state, right? So why would they represent the interests of your people if you care about the nation at that level, right? Well, you have no choice really then but to build your own sovereignty, and that involves your own actions, networking with others, and taking responsibility. If you don't want to take responsibility, fine, but just admit that it's not that you think the national model is better. Like, who do you have faith in at the national level? What is it? Your government? You have faith in your government that they're going to look after your interests? Who do you believe in? If you believe in yourself, you know that's a minoritarian strategy because you have to network with others. It takes a group of people who build a network, who build a method, who build a corporate model, who offer a product, and people want that product, and they rise up through the market, and eventually they can take sovereignty. but that needs to be done through the minoritarian strategy. It doesn't. You don't do it from the top down because that's not how it works. Now, there are cases where you can get someone elected and a top-down style revolution can take place, or if you control the military, and like the Spanish Civil War, anarchists and socialists are influencing things, and the military basically, Franco decides at a certain point, like, you know what, I don't want to live through this. Let's just set things back on track. But that's, again, if you want that solution, that also involves kind of a minoritarian strategy where you have to organize the resistance. You have to, if you're not in the military, then that kind of bars that path. But if you want to get your guy elected, it's still going to entail building a communications network and doing things on your own. And that's all the minoritarian strategy consists in, from my opinion. That can convert into a majoritarian strategy, but there's a common fallacy in thinking, I think, with people who call themselves nationalists who believe that this structure, the government, the nation state, and that involves a conflation of the nation and the state. The nation state is what matters, and we need to set it back on track. And it's like, no, power structures come and go, nations come and go, states come and go. You seize the moment through your own initiative. That's what matters, not this kind of ideal of the nation. Now, I'm going to read the rest of these comments, and I do want to end. So Octavian, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The founding fathers took a minoritarian strategy and organized, and that's what it takes. Now, sometimes an aristocratic minority can appeal to a majority and use nationalism, use liberalism, use these large scale concepts. But from my perspective, more of a cynical, like Machiavellian perspective, you need the power structures, and it's no use just relying on the power structures that already happen to exist in the nation that you like to identify with. I do have a Discord. The link's not there this time. It's in the last Perennial podcast. There's a link to that. I don't use it. The only reason I created it was that so people can come on and talk here. Discord's not a safe channel for communications. I'm currently in the process of trying to build what a good communications framework would look like, but I take my time, so... Mr. Coolmug, I'm not against people being responsible for themselves or making networks. I never have been. I believe there are many ways of coming at the problem, not just one. Nationalists don't assert the importance of nation states, but of the nation itself. That is, the people, white people. That's all. Yeah, but it's not just white people. Like, you're an English nationalist. You recognize these different nations. And the issue of whiteness is not just self-evident. Like, that's why the left criticizes the far right in that respect, the kind of fuzziness of the white category. And that's why I criticize, like, the nation idea as a step along a progression of community formation. And I'm more in favor of a process-based identity, a process-based in-group, where it's more like procedural how someone is brought into your in-group rather than just given through language, given through a taxonomy that happens to be inherited. Now, there's still value in our inheritance and value in the national identity that you come from, but I think to build a good network now, we need the level of precision that comes with a procedural-based, a process-based formation of identity. So that's my opinion. RJ, all power and change in society is dictated by minority. The high caste is a minority. Absolutely. It's always minorities that make the difference. Mr. Coolmug, they don't assert any particular way of going forward. Beyond that, some people assert mainstream political solutions. Others suggest metapolitical solutions. I think both ways have their merits. Yeah, use mainstream politics, but don't invest all your energies there. Metapolitical change in culture is fine, but as far as when we look to history, who has actually shaped the world, it's someone who had a minority identity who networked and built and actually changed things and lived in different ways. If you don't change your lifestyle as a result of your political philosophy, then your political philosophy is not going to lead anywhere. If political philosophy doesn't meet your own individual ethics, you're not going anywhere. Your philosophy is useless. It has to change your life, or it's not going to change your society. It has to change your life first. If we can't identify by culture, language, ethnicity, religion, flags, lands, then what are we supposed to identify with? What is the proper alternative? Value, and how to arrive at that value. And that can be defined precisely. And you can bring people into that. All of these, the heritage aspects, flags, religions, and like I think religion is actually critical here. And I think that basically I'm like an integralist. I believe that religion, politics, philosophy, education, everything, everything in sociology is connected, and we need kind of a meta level framework to encapsulate all of them. And actually, I think this was already done. It was done long ago with religion, and this was the original function of religion. There was no difference between church and state. The religion was the worldview, was the power structure, was everything. And I think that's what a golden age looks like, and that's where we need to go. That's my opinion. So, any closing thought, Ken?
No, that's good, and it's too bad we had technical difficulties because I feel like at the end here we finally got into some really good stuff. I imagine in the future when we have time, we'll either be able to do longer streams or longer prep, as they call it, to get warmed up in the beginning, so we can get past a little bit of the Irish versus the English debate
No,
and
I think that
actually get
had
into some
value. I
stuff.
actually appreciated that.
Yeah.
I will talk to you soon. Bye bye.